Part 3. The Conceptual Dimensions of Mental Illness. Chapter 5. Mental Illness as Metaphor. But the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. It is the one thing that cannot be learnt from others. Aristotle. Although most people assume that educated persons know what a metaphor is, I have learned that this may not be so. Medical students are educated persons, but most of them do not know what a metaphor is. Medical students often ask me what I mean when I say that mental illness is not a real illness, and I sometimes try to explain it by drawing a distinction between the literal and metaphorical uses of the word illness. One day, before beginning my explanation, I asked if anyone in the group, there must have been about 20 students sitting around the table, could define metaphor. Half of them raised their hands. I turned to one and asked him to tell us. He said he knew what a metaphor is, but could not define it. I suggested he give us an example. He thought for a moment and then said, "My mind is a blank," and not a single student laughed. It was then I realized that they did not know what a metaphor is, and perhaps why so many people do not or cannot distinguish literal diseases, such as cancer and heart disease, from metaphorical diseases, such as lovesickness and mental illness. For almost 30 years, one have maintained that mental illness is a metaphor. What does this contention mean? To many psychiatrists, it evidently does not mean much. For example, to Seymour Cady, an emeritus professor of psychiatry at Harvard, it means that if schizophrenia is a myth, then it is a myth with a powerful genetic component, a quip often quoted by psychiatrists as a rejoinder to my entire critique of psychiatry. While Cady's remark has some merit as a witticism, it has none as a refutation, for it ignores the fact that virtually any word can be used both literally and metaphorically. When a psychiatrist hears a joke that another psychiatrist calls sick, they both know that they are talking about something other than a real disease. However, when a psychiatrist hears another psychiatrist say John Hinckley Jr. is sick, he believes indeed, all psychiatrists and most other people believe, that they are talking about a real disease. After all, that is why Hinckley is in a hospital, or at least in a building called a hospital, and not in a prison. Isn't it astonishing that psychiatrists can be so sure that every time a member of their profession asserts that a person is sick, they are confronted with the task of diagnosing a real disease rather than understanding a figure of speech? Unfortunately, if a person does not understand what a metaphor is, then he will think that my assertion that mental illness is a metaphor is nothing but a put-down of psychiatrists and an attack on psychiatry. Let me briefly sketch, therefore, the fundamentals of linguistic analysis necessary for understanding the perspective I have tried to bring to bear on mental illness and mental healing. The nature of metaphor. The characterization of man as the animal that uses language has become so familiar that it has lost its force. It is particularly ironic, then, that the psychiatrist, the physician specializing in the study and treatment of so-called mental illness, should now turn a deaf ear to his patient's words. For, as Justin Martyr, c. 100-165, one of the fathers of the church, put it so well, by examining the patient's tongue, physicians find out the diseases of the body, and philosophers the diseases of the mind. In other words, to discover diseases of the body, the regular physician examines the patient's body and looks for the manifestations of disease. This is not what the psychiatrist does. To discover diseases of the mind, he examines the patient's speech and looks for its meaning. Actually, all this is self-evident. If a person bleeds profusely from a bodily orifice or is deeply jaundiced, anyone can tell that he is ill. Similarly, if a person says crazy things, if he hears voices or sees things, then anyone can tell that he is insane. Nevertheless, people, perhaps especially psychiatrists, forget that mental illness is inferred from language rather than from lesions. In their current enthusiasm for viewing mental illness as brain disease, psychiatrists have convinced themselves, and many others, that abnormal ideas are a symptom of abnormal thought processes, that abnormal thought processes are a symptom of abnormal brain processes, and that the remedy for the mental patient's bad life lies in good chemistry. But how do we know what anyone thinks? how do we determine what constitutes true, normal, or false, abnormal thought or belief? The answer is that we know these things only through the intuitive or explicit analysis of language. That is, through the meaning we attach to words, sentences, and figures of speech, our own and those of others. What is a metaphor? A keen analytical understanding of language and meaning characterizes the writings of Greek and Roman philosophers. Indeed, Aristotle's definition of metaphor is still as good as any. Metaphor consists in giving a thing a name that belongs to something else. The something else to which the name belongs is the original or core referent of the word used in its literal sense. Who determines what the literal meaning of a word is? No one does. It is a matter of convention. How convention does this need not concern us here? What is important for us is that if a person does not have a clear understanding of the literal use and meaning of a word, he will be unable to understand its metaphorical use and meaning, and will also be unable to understand what someone means when he says that is a metaphor. Since language is metaphorical through and through, and since anyone who speaks a language competently knows this intuitively, two simple examples should suffice. A man dies and his young son is told that he went to heaven. However, when a man dies and goes to heaven, his going is not the same sort of action as that entailed in his widow's going to Italy, nor is heaven the same sort of place as Rome. A man comes home, and as he walks through the front door calls to his wife, "Honey, I am home." Like jokes, which they so closely resemble, metaphors like these cannot be explained. If one tries to do so, in the process to use another metaphor, one succeeds only in killing them. We should note further that the use of metaphor, as Colin Murray Turbain puts it, involves the pretense that something is the case when it is not. The pretense may or may not be disclosed by the author, depending mainly on whether, in presenting his analogy, he makes use of the qualification as if. For example, a person may say, "I shall view man as if he were a machine," or he may say, "Man is a machine." Typically, the pretense is not revealed by the grammar. Turbain offers several pairs of terms that display no grammatical difference, the first member of the pair exemplifying the literal, the second the metaphorical. Use of a term such as the timber wolf is a wolf, man is a wolf, muscle fatigue, metal fatigue. Isn't it possible, then, that at least sometimes the same sort of relationship applies to the pair bodily disease, mental disease? To put it as modestly as possible, isn't it possible that at least in some cases, when an assertion is made about a person's being mentally ill, the illness asserted is metaphorical? There are countless other ways of getting at or explaining what metaphor is. Samuel Johnson, for example, said that a metaphor gives you two ideas for one. Turbain adds that a metaphor also gives two ideas as one. It is illuminating, in this connection, to cite the synonyms and antonyms dictionaries give for the words literal and metaphoric. The synonyms of literal are verbal, veritable, accurate, true, exact, precise, regular, real, actual, undeviating, veracious, undisputed. Among its antonyms we find, in addition to metaphorical, the following: wrong, erring, misleading, mistaken, false, erroneous, deceiving, untrue, delusive, beguiling, fallacious, unsound, lying, distorted, unreal, allegorical, elusive, colloquial, symbolical, figurative, and mythical. Actually, as the examples cited illustrate, everyone who speaks uses metaphors, just as everyone uses nouns and verbs and prepositions, even persons who do not explicitly understand the character of these speech elements. Hobbes saw clearly the benefits and risks that thus accrue to us as a language-using species. As men abound in copiousness of language, so they become more wise or more mad than ordinary. Nor is it possible without letters for any man to become either excellently wise or, unless his memory be hurt by disease or ill constitution of organs, excellently foolish. For words are wise men's counters, they do but reckon by them, but they are the money of fools. From the vast modern literature on metaphor, I have here chosen to follow Turbain's analysis. His book, The Myth of Metaphor, is a good guide to the literature. Toward the end of Leviathan, Hobbes uses the Roman Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation as his example for driving home his point about the abuse of literalizing metaphors. "This is my body" are equivalent to these. "This signifies or represents my body," and it is an ordinary figure of speech, but but to take it literally is an abuse, emphasis in the original. Actually, we have no choice in the matter of using metaphors. We must, said C.S. Lewis, use metaphors. The feelings and the imagination need that support. The great thing is to keep the intellect free from them, to remember that they are metaphors. Obviously, doing so cannot be easy, or else wise men would not have felt it necessary, in every age and every language, to keep reminding us of the duty of this remembrance. One more observation about metaphor may be appropriate here, namely, that there is a close and intimate connection between humor and metaphor. This is because what often gives a joke its mental punch, what makes us sit up, take notice, and laugh, is the subtle switching of criteria for classifying things. The following story, supposedly told by a high-ranking Chinese official to a visiting American dignitary, the context is important, is a good example. The Chinese official asks his American guest which is the largest country in the world. Why, the Soviet Union, of course, is the reply. No, one, I'm afraid you are wrong. It is Cuba. Cuba, says the American incredulously, sensing that he is being put on. Yes, Cuba. May first explain, continues the Chinese jokester earnestly. You see, Cuba is very large. Its government is in Moscow, its army is in Africa, and its people are in Florida. While this will surely kill it as a joke, let me point out that the criterion by which we measure the size of a country is not the location of its government, or army, or people, but the size of its surface area. I hope these observations will suffice as building blocks for constructing an alternative metaphorical view of mental illness. We must, of course, keep two things in mind. One is that there is no such thing as a metaphor per se. What a metaphor is depends on convention and context. This is why I emphasize that if there is no literal meaning, or no agreement on literal meaning, which comes to the same thing, then there is also no metaphorical meaning. The other thing to keep in mind is that a metaphor need not be, and usually is not, an isolated word or phrase, such as might be suggested by the examples I have offered. Instead, a metaphor, or a set of related metaphors, is often elaborated into an extended and sustained form called allegory, parable, model, myth, or even science. In my book, The Myth of Mental Illness, I have tried to show that psychiatry is a myth built on the metaphor of mental illness and its extensions, such as psychiatric diagnosis, prognosis, hospitalization, treatment, and so forth. Mental illness, from brain disease to metaphoric non-disease. How does the literal meaning of a word become transformed into its metaphorical meaning, which may then be interpreted literally? For example, how did Jesus' thanksgiving over bread and wine become symbols, metaphors, of his body and blood, and how did the symbols become interpreted literally, as in the doctrine of transubstantiation? We know from history how this complex process, stimulated by the Church Fathers, grew and captured the popular imagination, and how the metaphor was demystified, deliteralized, at least for some Protestants, during the Reformation. Since it is not generally accepted that mental illness is a literalized metaphor, there is no accepted account of how it became so. I shall briefly summarize how I think this has happened. The changing social context of mental illness. For about 200 years, from 1700 to 1900, physicians conceived of madness on the model of medical disease. Insanity was a brain disease or a manifestation of such a disease. They were basically right. Until well into the 20th century, the majority of the patients in state mental hospitals suffered from brain diseases, most of them from general paresis, neurosyphilis, and the rest from a variety of toxic organic psychoses caused by alcohol, head injury, and various infections of the central nervous system. When the early 19th century psychiatrists spoke of mental diseases or diseases of the mind, they understood and often explicitly stated that these expressions were figures of speech or metaphors. Freud's work radically altered this situation. Rightly, Freud is praised for introducing meaning into the discourse about madness. But wrongly, he is not blamed for introducing the imagery that legitimized a conceptually promiscuous and politically odious use of the idea of insanity. How did Freud do this? By abandoning brain disease as his model for insanity and replacing it with the dream. As he put it, dreams are the prototypes of all psychopathological structures. Freud thus jettisoned the linkage between insanity and somatic illness and substituted for it an analogy or putative identity between insanity and a normal, everyday feature of inner mental experience, namely dreaming. It is not surprising that Freud should have been so enthusiastic about his model. He was not a psychiatrist and was not even interested in being a doctor. What he wanted was to be a religious or quasi-religious leader. For this, he needed a powerful, preferably literalized, metaphor, and that is what he fashioned out of the idea of insanity, which until then was only a disease or putative disease, a notion not especially useful for etiological purposes. The result was twofold. The first was a universalization of the idea of insanity, exemplified by Freud's psychopathology of everyday life. Instead of madness being methodical, in Shakespeare's sense, and therefore not an illness, Freud's claim was that everyday life was psychopathological, and therefore sanity, no less than madness, was a form of insanity. The second result was the literalization of the metaphor of mental illness, exemplified by Freud's cryptochemical theories of actual neurosis and other mental illnesses, and by the neurochemical fantasies of contemporary psychopharmacologists. There is an interesting historical parallel between the Protestant reformers and the psychoanalytic psychiatrists' responsibility for transforming inspiring metaphors into dogmatic, literalized metaphors that no longer function as metaphors. During the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the popes and other church leaders did not insist that the consecrated bread and wine of the Eucharist were the literal body and blood of the Savior. Only after the Reformation gathered steam did the Council of Trent, in 1552, proclaim the doctrine of transubstantiation, insisting on the interpretation of the sacramental bread and wine as literally and miraculously the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Similarly, only after the Freudian Revolution got underway did psychiatrists begin to insist, as they now typically do, that mental illness, far from being a metaphor, is literally an illness like any other illness. That is, always and without a doubt, a disease of the brain. Ironically, while the Protestant reformers were only indirectly responsible for the doctrine of the transubstantiation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, Freud and his followers are directly responsible for the transubstantiation of personal and social problems into medical diseases. Insanity, from medical illness to medicalization of conflict. From its beginning as asylum care in the 17th century until the advent of the modern psychotherapies at the end of the 19th century, everyone knew perfectly well that psychiatry was a hybrid, a combination of confinement and care, law, and medicine. It was obvious that the insane person, the subject of psychiatry, was an individual in conflict with others, typically members of his family or the authorities and agencies of society. The psychiatrist's task, in his dual role as physician and agent of society with special powers and privileges granted him by the state, was to manage and resolve this conflict. The complex consequences of this confrontation, and often collusion as well, between madman and mad doctor on the one hand, and of the collaboration, and often conflict as well, between the psychiatrist and the patient's family and society on the other, need not detain us here. What should concern us is not losing sight of the fact that psychiatry was born out of this complex context of conflict, cooperation, and collusion, and that the problems and solutions thus generated remain its backbone. The advent of psychoanalysis and other individual psychotherapies further confused this already complicated situation by introducing the notion that the psychiatrist was an agent of the patient whose job was to provide therapy for him. But what was the psychotherapist expected to do for the patient? Treat his mental illness, of course. And how? Did the patient know that he was mentally ill? By suffering from conflicts, of course. A man said he wanted to make love to his wife but couldn't because he was impotent. A woman said she wanted to make love to her husband but couldn't because her tightened perineal muscles prevented the act, and so on. Before anyone quite realized what had happened, a new class of diseases was born, diseases said to be the manifestations of, or caused by, intrapsychic conflicts. And what is an intrapsychic conflict? Why, a new name for the most elementary fact of human existence, namely choice. Actually, In ordinary usage, conflict is a clash or contest between two discrete opponents, typically individuals or groups. We can also speak of conflicting ideas or values. But to say that a person has a conflict, for example, between remaining faithful to his wife and making love to his secretary, is another way of saying that he has a choice between two alternative courses of conduct. The existential legal transformation of choice into conflict and of conflict into sickness is conditioned partly by an extension of the concept of disease from bodily illness to mental illness, and partly by an extension of the concept of conflict from a clash between opposing persons to a clash between opposing desires in the mind of a single individual. Metaphorization of the concept of conflict and the subsequent literalization of the metaphor are the reasons for the seeming paradox that the more freedom of choice people have, the more often they suffer from mental illness. The realization that this is not a statistical correlation or an etiological causation, as it is sometimes mistakenly believed to be, but only a tautology, has apparently escaped most people's attention. Obviously, the more choices a person has, the more conflict he can or may have over selecting one course of action over another. Of course, not every choice generates a conflict, but many do. Hence, the more choices a person has, the more conflicts he is likely to have. If we regard every such conflict as a problem, and define every such problem as a mental illness, then it will follow that giving a person a choice will be almost the same as giving him a conflict, which, in turn, will be seen as giving him a mental illness. Could this be the reason why conventional approaches to the etiology, treatment, and prevention of mental illness are not just unproductive, but counterproductive, if not positively silly? Actually, the extension of the core meaning of conflict from a clash between contending persons or parties to opposition between incompatible ideas or values, and thence to a metaphorical conflict between unconscious impulses or intrapsychic forces, has had two vastly important consequences. First, this transformation is responsible for launching us down that slippery slope we call psychiatry, psychoanalysis, or behavioral science. At the top of this slope stand persons making choices. At the bottom lie patients suffering from mental diseases. How one gets from there to here, in other words, how a person jumps, stumbles, or is pushed down a slope so slippery that once he begins his downward slide, he is virtually unable to stop and climb back up again, I try to explain in this book. Second, this transformation has led to an important redefinition of the ostensible subject matter and scope of psychiatry, changing it from a forensic into an anthropological psychological discipline, from the study of insanity to the study of interpersonal and intrapersonal relations. The title and subtitle of one of the most prestigious American psychiatric journals, founded in 1938 by Harry Stack Sullivan, is significant and illustrative. It is Psychiatry, the study of interpersonal processes. Interpersonal processes? Surely that must encompass religion and law, anthropology and politics, economics and psychology, history, philosophy, semantics, in short, virtually every discipline and field of study other than the hardest of hard sciences. The change in psychiatry's subject matter, from asylum care to interpersonal relations, had several immediate and important consequences. In the first place, psychiatry gained new prestige both as a basic science and as a clinical practice based on scientific principles. The alleged scientific basis of the new dynamic psychiatry was that it rested on the scientific study of human development and unconscious mental life, while the alleged scientific basis of the new psychological therapies, especially psychoanalysis, was that they rested on the rational application of fresh knowledge discovered by the researches of the depth psychologists. That this psychiatric psychoanalytic science was, in fact, an ideology and a religion or anti-religion like Marxist dialectical materialism, has remained one of the best-kept secrets of the 20th century. The upshot is that psychiatry has succeeded in shedding its image as an institutional and forensic enterprise, concerned with protecting the civilly insane by means of confinement, and the criminally insane by means of the insanity defense. Instead of psychiatric ideas and interventions remaining restricted to the narrow confines of incarcerating the obviously insane, whether under so-called civil or criminal statutory auspices, psychiatric principles and practices became diffused into every nook and cranny of social relations, from disputes about divorce and child custody to interpretations of international conflict, terrorism, and war. Moreover, regardless of how far from medicine they have wandered, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and psychotherapists never stopped insisting that they were bona fide doctors doing bona fide medical work. Thus, it would be a mistake to believe, as some psychiatric historians and intellectuals do, that the early 20th century physician psychotherapists, whether orthodox or heretical Freudians, did not cherish their medical identity and did not court the approval of the medical profession for their particular brand of therapy. Illustrative is the fact that, in 1926, a group of German-speaking psychotherapists founded the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy, with the support of such seemingly non-medically oriented therapists as Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, Karen Horney, and Kurt Lewin. Today, Ronald Lang continues in this tradition, displaying the same desire to appear as a real doctor. "I regard psychiatry," he declared in 1985, "as epitomizing anti-psychiatry. The approach that I have attempted to develop in theory and practice is an approach which I hope and intend to be a genuine practice of mental or psychic healing. The psychiatrists are the anti-psychiatrists, not the attempt to practice genuine psychiatry," emphasis added. All this has been anticipated, in his characteristically elusive fashion, by C.S. Lewis. "I have great hopes," he has Screwtape saying, "that we shall learn in due time how to emotionalize and mythologize their science. The worship of sex and some aspects of psychoanalysis may here prove useful." In this connection, I want to mention another effort to rehabilitate psychiatry. It is a sad and silly episode, now largely forgotten, although it enjoyed considerable attention and acclaim only recently. The story begins in 1933 with the publication by Alfred Korzybski of a book titled Science and Sanity, which its author intended to be a textbook showing how in modern scientific methods we can find factors of sanity to be tested empirically. Observing that crazy people talk crazy, Korzybski declared that our sanity is connected with correct symbolism. The abuse of symbolism is like the abuse of food and drink. It makes people ill, emphasis added. No doubt about it, the abuse of symbolism does make people ill, but not by giving them cancer of the pancreas. How does it make them ill? By metaphorically giving them a metaphoric illness, which we conventionally call insanity. It would be charitable to call Korzybski's attitude toward psychiatry deplorable. A Polish nobleman to the core, he uncritically accepted psychiatric slavery and indeed proposed to retrain the serfs with his own methods. In hospitals for the mentally ill, two equally large groups of accessible patients exhibiting similar clinical symptoms should be selected and isolated. A physician who himself has undergone a training should attempt to retrain the SR of one group. The other group should not be retrained. It would be the control group. S is Korzybski's abbreviation for his non-Aristotelian system. I do not know why it never occurred to Korzybski, who claimed to be especially interested in the metaphorical uses of language, that insanity might be an illness like lovesickness, rather than like leukemia. Maybe this is just another illustration of the principle that the human mind is an organ for rationalizing rather than thinking. Korzybski wanted to believe that he had made a fresh discovery about the illness called insanity. Actually, he was applying his positivistic prejudices to what he, like the psychiatrists, regarded as the crazy speech of crazy people. Be that as it may, Korzybski's work generated a movement called general semantics. Although the semanticists ought to have known better, they didn't. Ignoring that the idea of insanity receives its nourishment from roots deeply buried in psychiatry and the law, they simply appropriated the concept and proceeded to give it their own meaning. Insanity was the improper use of language, and thereby hangs a long and interesting tale whose briefest outline must suffice here. Hobbes said the same thing. There is yet another fault in the discourses of some men, which may also be numbered amongst the sorts of madness, namely that abuse of words, whereof I have spoken before. When men write whole volumes of such stuff, are they not mad, or intend to make others so? And particularly in the question of transubstantiation. Led by Anatole Rappaport, who began his career as a mathematician and ended it as a lackey of the psychiatrist lobby, the general semanticists, many of whom soon became general system theorists, were eager to embrace and be embraced by the psychiatrists. Their wish was granted, and their work was thereby doomed to failure and oblivion. Instead of scrutinizing psychiatry, they saluted it. What is the evidence for this sellout of the semanticists? It is that, despite their academic sophistication, they chose to authenticate rather than analyze the term insanity, and that, despite their civil libertarian pretensions, they chose to diagnose the discourse of psychotics rather than denounce the despotism of the psychiatrists. In short, the semanticists did nothing to challenge the theoretical premises and social practices of psychiatry. Instead, they hitched their wagon to its economic star and used the idea of insanity to aggrandize themselves and legitimize their self-styled science. How did Rappaport study sanity and insanity? By observing how sane and insane people talked. How did he know who these people were? By assuming that psychiatrists were sane and psychotics insane. The following illustrates how Rappaport presents his own psychiatric political prejudices as if they were semantic scientific conclusions. At the other extreme is the language of psychotics and people under the spell of superstition and demagogy, whose linguistic behavior violates semantic principles. Such reactions make possible gigantic sales volumes unrelated to the quality of the product. They make wars inevitable. It is all here. The uncritical acceptance of the psychiatrist's judgment of who is sane and who is insane, the arrogant anti-capitalism and hostility to the free market, the resentment against the ordinary man's desire to make his own choices. Finally, notwithstanding a theory of insanity totally unrelated to biological or medical criteria, Rappaport offers a brazenly flattering endorsement of the science of psychiatry. That is why cultural anthropology is so important a science, and so are psychiatry and semantics. These sciences are all in the forward direction towards self-insight. Clearly, Rappaport learned his psychiatry from his paymasters in the Michigan State Hospital system rather than from Mark Twain or Chekhov. So much for the efforts to relocate lunacy from brain to mind to language. I maintain that regardless of whether psychiatry wears the mask of medicine, claiming to be concerned with brain diseases and their cures, or the mask of an anthropological existential science, claiming to be concerned with man's mental life and the resolution of his conflicts, it remains, inexorably, a fundamentally forensic enterprise. Insanity, mental illness, psychopathology, or whatever it may be called, is in fact a dual fiction, conceptual and tactical, scientific and forensic. See Chapter 11. Metaphoric disease is metaphor, not disease. Actually, the view that mental illnesses are metaphoric diseases, in other words, that the mind can be sick only in the sense in which a joke can be sick, is about as old as psychiatry itself. This should not surprise us. After all, the 19th century psychiatrists could not have been unaware of the fact that they were reclassifying sins as sicknesses. Moreover, educated men that they were, they must have known what Plato had said about what they were doing. And to require medicine, said one, not merely for wounds or the incidence of some seasonal maladies, but because of sloth, and compel the ingenious sons of Asclepius to invent for diseases such names as fluxes and flatulencies. Don't you think that disgraceful? Those surely are, he said, newfangled and monstrous strange names of diseases. One can only marvel at the clarity with which Plato had already distinguished between real and false, literal and metaphorical, diseases. He also understood that metaphors are the raw materials out of which the philosopher king must fashion the noble lies necessary for his rule. It seems likely that our rulers will have to make considerable use of falsehood and deception for the benefit of their subjects. We said, I believe, that the use of that sort of thing was in the category of medicine, and the way all this is brought to pass must be unknown to any but the rulers. Moreover, even before there was such a thing as psychiatry in Germany, that country's greatest poet and man of letters foresaw the triumph of the medical metaphor in the modern world and trembled at the spectacle. I myself must also say, I believe it is true that in the end humanitarianism will triumph. Only I fear that at the same time the world will be one big hospital and each person will be the other's humane keeper. Nearly 2 centuries elapsed before the world caught up with Goethe. As the semanticist Weller Embler observes, the 19th century saw all too clearly the possibility of machines and the world as a vast factory, and the 20th century sees the possibility of the whole world as a hospital. Bodily disease and mental disturbance, an analogy. So far as I have been able to determine, the first psychiatrist to state that mental diseases are metaphoric diseases was the Viennese psychiatrist Ernst von Feuchtersleben, 1806 to 1848. In his book The Principles of Medical Psychology, published in 1845, Feuchtersleben wrote, "The maladies of the spirit alone, in abstract, that is, error and sin, can be called diseases of the mind only per analogy. They come not within the jurisdiction of the physician, but that of the teacher or clergyman, who again are called physicians of the mind only per analogy." Just as psychiatry was beginning to establish itself as a genuine medical specialty, Feuchtersleben was thus calling attention to the purely analogical relations between medical and mental diseases, regular and psychiatric physicians. Nor was Feuchtersleben alone in recognizing, during the first half of the 19th century, the analogical use of the term illness that was developing among asylum doctors, and in pointing out that diseases of the soul or spirit are not diseases. In a debate on the question of the appropriateness of the treatment of the insane by non-physicians, Maximilian Jacobi, 1775 to 1858, director of the Irrenanstalt Siegburg from 1825 to 1858, objected to the collective classification of mental illnesses, Seelenkrankheiten, as illnesses, and to the underlying assumption that, in such cases, the mind itself is diseased. Rejecting the postulate advanced by contemporary German somaticists that every madman era suffers from two illnesses, one of the body and one of the mind, he declared, "I confess that I can no more conceive of an illness of the mind analogous to that of the body than I can of any means by which such an illness could be observed." Finally, honing in on what we would now regard as the existential core of the problem, Jacobi attributed mental illness to a misuse of self-determination, and insisted that such problems fall outside the realm of illnesses and have, in fact, nothing whatever in common with them. Interestingly, Emil Kraepelin, 1855 to 1926, the father of modern German psychiatry, also recognized this analogical relationship, but expressed it in a decidedly less firm voice, saying only that in the strictest terms we cannot speak of the mind as becoming diseased. These caveats were ignored, of course, by psychiatrists and non-psychiatrists alike. The idea that mental illness is a real illness, like any other, was simply too important and useful. It was an idea whose time had come, and its march across the pages of history was not going to be stopped by a person here and there noting its metaphorical character. The next watershed in the literalization of the metaphor of mental illness is marked by Bleuler's invention of schizophrenia. Bleuler realized that he was basing this diagnosis on the fact that the so-called schizophrenic patient uses metaphors, and yet was willing, perhaps eager, to see the patient as literally sick. One of the cases Bleuler describes in his epoch-making work on schizophrenia is that of a woman who claims that she possesses Switzerland. And in the same sense, she says, "I am Switzerland." She may also say, "I am freedom," since for her Switzerland meant nothing else than freedom. What makes this woman a schizophrenic rather than a metaphoric? Bleuler explains, "The difference between the use of such phrases in the healthy and in the schizophrenic rests in the fact that in the former it is a mere metaphor, whereas for the patients the dividing line between direct and indirect representation has been obscured. The result is that they frequently think of these metaphors in a literal sense." As I showed in my book on schizophrenia, Bleuler was fully aware and deeply impressed by the metaphors of schizophrenic patients, which, he insisted, they interpreted literally. In a remarkable passage, one of several that could have been written only by a Protestant psychiatrist, Bleuler states, "I would like to call your attention to the manifold significance of Catholic symbolism. Homo Dei in the image of mortals could just as well have been the brainchild of a modern schizophrenic. This seems to me bitterly ironic. When the psychiatrist calls physically healthy persons who do not want to be patients, and the building in which he imprisons them, hospitals, the psychiatrist insists that he is not using metaphors at all. But when a person who is unhappy and perhaps makes others unhappy uses language in a similar way, then the psychiatrist insists that the troubled and troubling person is a literal patient who is literally ill with the literal disease called schizophrenia. Today, the literalization of the metaphor of mental illness, with schizophrenia, ironically, as its paradigm, is so entrenched that, like an accepted religious doctrine, people either do not see the literalized metaphor at all, or if they do see it, they prefer to look the other way. The views of Seymour Keedy, quoted earlier in this chapter, are illustrative. Diabetes mellitus is analogous to schizophrenia in many ways. Both are symptom clusters or syndromes, one described by somatic and biochemical abnormalities, the other by psychological. Each may have many etiologies and show a range of intensity from severe and debilitating to latent or borderline. There is also evidence that genetic and environmental influences operate in the development of both. The medical model seems to be quite as appropriate for the one as for the other. Note that Keedy first analogizes somatic and psychological symptom clusters, much as the doctrine of transubstantiation analogizes Jesus' body and the consecrated host, and then proceeds to treat them as if they were the same sorts of things. As a result, he misinterprets what is meant by a metaphor, treating a metaphorical disease as a disease instead of as a metaphor. This is an absurd mistake few of us would make if the word used metaphorically was not as weighty as the word disease. For example, no one thinks that a mixture of orange juice and vodka is a type of tool for tightening and loosening screws. Let me briefly explain. By screwdriver, we ordinarily mean a tool used by carpenters. We also give this name to a drink made of orange juice and vodka. Clearly, saying that the drink is a metaphoric screwdriver is not saying that it is some other kind of screwdriver. It is saying that it is not a screwdriver at all. Similarly, if I say that mental illness is a metaphorical illness, I'm not saying that it is some other kind of illness. I am saying that it is not an illness at all. I emphasize this in the hope of transcending the usual psychiatric misunderstanding of and rejoinders to my assertion that mental illness is a metaphor, often phrased thus: what difference does it make what you call mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar illness, etc.? Regardless of what you call it, we know it is an illness, just like paresis. Soon we shall identify its somatic basis in the brain. Such a rejoinder misses my point. It is like saying that it does not matter what you call a mixture of orange juice and vodka, because I know that it is an instrument for fastening and loosening screws. If that is not yet apparent to some skeptics, it soon will be when the drink called screwdriver will be shown to be a real screwdriver. Placing mental illness as metaphor in the same class as mental illness as abnormal behavior is like placing the screwdriver as drink in the same class as the screwdriver as tool, which would lead us to sell metaphorical screwdrivers in hardware stores and literal screwdrivers in bars. Literalized metaphor as social convention. Why do people, even if they recognize the difference between symbol and the object it symbolizes, often treat literalized metaphors as if they were the thing the metaphor names? For example, non-Catholics, and even many Catholics, recognize that bread and wine are not the body and blood of a man long dead who is said to be a deity. In certain situations, however, they all behave. Catholics more often than non-Catholics, as if the symbol were the thing symbolized. Why do people act this way? Catholics do so mainly because this is what establishes their identity as Catholics. Non-Catholics do so mainly because it is, say in a church, the polite thing to do. Although psychiatrists insist that mental diseases are real diseases, and although many persons do not believe this, most people, much of the time, act as if they did. They also recognize that disagreements are personal and social events usually called conflicts and are not the symptoms of undemonstrated and indemonstrable pathological processes in synapses in the central nervous system. In certain situations, however, they all behave, psychiatrists more often than non-psychiatrists, as if the symbol were the thing symbolized. That is, as if schizophrenia were actually like syphilis and depression like diabetes. The question is, why do people act like this? Psychiatrists do so mainly because this is what establishes their identity as physicians. Non-psychiatrists do so mainly because, as a rule, it is the polite and proper thing to do in our society, lest one risk revealing oneself as stupid or sick. A further lesson from language. Many people rightly fear being manipulated by the slick and deceptive use of words, especially when it comes to matters they think they understand as well as they want to. Hence the frequently expressed belief, "I don't care what you call it, I know this is X," where X might stand for a thing or idea. When this sentiment characterizes a person's attitude toward an abstract noun, such as democracy or mental illness, then we have a problem if we try to change his mind, which, as such a person himself admits, is closed. Assuming that no one who has read this far has a closed mind about diseases of the mind, I want to offer a brief digression into linguistic analysis in order to further enrich our grasp of what it means to view mental illness as a metaphor. When we say that someone has a closed mind, everyone recognizes that the mind is not literally an area or space that may be closed or open. Accordingly, people do not expect chauffeurs to drive through an open mind, but they do expect psychiatrists to cure a sick mind. How can a mind be sick? How can a foot be sick, or a tiger be sick, or a tree be sick, or the economy be sick, or a joke be sick? Is there anything that cannot be sick? Perhaps we best begin with a brief analysis of the words sick and ill. The terms ill and sick are often used interchangeably. For example, we say Jones has pneumonia, he is quite ill. We can just as well say Jones has pneumonia, he is quite sick. However, ill has a history and a scope that have nothing to do with medicine or disease. It then means roughly bad, unfortunate, tragic, or something of that sort. For example, we can speak of ill will or ill fate, but we cannot speak of sick will or sick fate. Moreover, we can speak of ill health, but cannot substitute sick as an adjective for health. On the other hand, ill has a more restricted implication than sick, so that there are many instances in which we can use the latter term but not the former. For example, we don't say, the tiger is ill, or the tree is ill, but we do say the tiger is sick, or the tree is sick. Revealingly, the strict use of ill is restricted to persons. Not even body parts or organs may be ill, although they may be sick. We don't say, his hand is ill, or he has an ill hand, but we say, his hand is sick, or he has a sick hand. If we want to convey the idea of ill about an animal, a part of the human body, or even an abstract noun, then we use sick. Thus, we can say about a person that his liver is sick, and we can also say that a cat or a car, a television set or a joke, or even a whole society is sick. None of them can be ill, however. Qualifying ill and sick with mentally introduces new possibilities and limitations into how those terms can be used and what they mean. Interestingly, mentally ill and mentally sick tend to function linguistically very much as the metaphorically sick functions, and not at all as does the literally sick or ill. By metaphorically sick, I mean that the person uses it to express disapproval or dislike of the referent or attributes some sort of malfunctioning or wrongness to it, whereas by literally sick or ill, I mean that the person uses it to express the specific idea of some sort of bodily disorder or medical disease. The literally or medically sick occurs in all tenses and moods and with all sorts of time modifiers. The metaphorically or mentally sick does not. For example, we can say all of the following. Jones is sick, he cannot work. Jones was sick, he could not work. Jones has been sick, he has not been working. Jones had been sick, he missed a lot of work. Jones will be sick, he will not be at work. Don't get sick, Jones, you don't want to miss work. When metaphorically sick is used explicitly, it has a much more restricted range of tenses. We can say the joke is sick or the joke was sick, but it would be weird to say the joke has been sick or the joke will be sick, and it would be absurd to say the joke is often sick. The psychiatrically or mentally sick, which I have long contended is covertly metaphorical, has the same restricted range of use as does the overtly metaphorical sick. Thus, we can say, Jones is mentally sick or ill, he shot the president. But it would be wrong, as well as odd, to say, when Jones will be mentally sick, he will shoot the president. If we thought this about Jones, we would say, he is mentally sick. It would be odder still to say, "Don't get mentally sick, Jones. You don't want to shoot the president." Humorous as that sounds, the psychiatric and witty dimensions of mentally sick would become indistinguishable were we to say, "Jones is mentally sick today, he shoots the president," or "Jones is often mentally sick, he shoots a lot of presidents." Some of these differences between sick and mentally sick stem from the fact that we tend to use sick to describe conditions and mentally sick to describe characteristics, and that we usually attribute more permanence to the latter than to the former. Thus, Jones may have pneumonia and may recover from it. Hence we say, Jones is sick and Jones was sick. But if Jones is an American, so long as Jones is alive, we cannot in the same way say, Jones is an American, and Jones was an American. For the latter generally means not that he is no longer an American, but that he is no longer alive. It may also mean, of course, that Jones has renounced or lost his American citizenship. Contentions and refutations. To further sharpen what I mean when I assert that mental illness is a metaphor, let us now consider the principal arguments with which psychiatrists and others typically try to refute this contention. He acts sick, he looks sick, he is sick. One such refutation goes something like this. Here is a man who is hallucinating and has delusions. He has no money, no place to go, his family rejects him. He has been in several mental hospitals, and psychiatrists have repeatedly diagnosed him as suffering from schizophrenia. You mean to tell me he is not sick? Note that to describe a person as having hallucinations and delusions, and as having been diagnosed as schizophrenic, is in effect the same as saying that he is sick, but without identifying the criteria for illness. So we must ask, by what criterion is this person sick? If literal illness is identifiable bodily disease, then having hallucinations or delusions and being called schizophrenic are simply irrelevant to ascertaining whether or not a person is sick. A comparison will make the point clear. Suppose a person were to say, "Look at this cute animal. Doesn't he look just like a baby bear? He is a teddy bear. People call him a koala bear. You mean to tell me he is not a bear?" The koala bear is, however, not a bear, but a marsupial. Calling it a bear is a mistake. The same sort of error may be committed by a child who, upon being taken to see a whale, exclaims, "What a huge fish!" If not mentally sick, then mentally healthy. Another closely related rebuttal rests on the way people unwittingly entrap themselves and try to entrap me into the consequences of the language of mental illness. Thus, when I assert that a person psychiatrists consider to be mentally ill is not ill, my critics assume that I consider him to be mentally healthy. This rejoinder is hurled against my views in an astonishingly mindless manner, as the following example illustrates. It is clinical evidence, detailed investigative reports, case histories, etc., showing that a representative sample of such putative neurotics are completely healthy that Szasz fails to offer his readers, emphasis added. This is sheer nonsense. Again, a historical example will quickly show why. At the height of the Inquisition, a Christian was seen as either a faithful Catholic or a heretic. At that time, when a Christian acted in a religiously deviant fashion, he was called a heretic. We would not now consider such a person a heretic, but neither would we consider him a faithful Catholic. Likewise, it does not follow that by rejecting the concept of mental illness, one commits oneself to the view that those now considered mentally ill are mentally healthy. I reject both concepts and terms as false labels for social conformity and deviance, social competence and incompetence, and other behavioral characteristics. Treating metaphoric illness as illness. Still another argument, seemingly more sophisticated and scientific, goes like this. We, psychiatrists, follow the medical approach to mental illness. We believe this is the correct approach. There are others, and here the author or speaker may or may not mention me by name, who prefer the social approach, but they are wrong because the advocates of this argument then go on to cite studies about the genetic determinants of schizophrenia and the effectiveness of drugs in controlling this disease. I am often confronted with this argument, sometimes by reporters or others from the news media, and have concluded that it is founded on so successful a distortion of my position that it is virtually impossible to counter it. For if a well-meaning questioner does not see the point on which this riddle turns, no amount of fresh explanation about the mythology of mental illness is likely to make him see it. Still, I try to answer it along this line. Let us go back 400 years. People then believed in witches, and the official explanation of witchcraft was theological. Suppose someone had come along and said, "There are no witches." Witch is only a name we now attach to poor and helpless people, usually women. Would it be proper to call this person's views a social approach to witches, as opposed to the official theological approach to them? Of course not. How can a person have any kind of an approach to X if he believes that X does not exist? X may here stand for witches, unicorns, the devil, God, or mental illness. What the disbeliever in witches offers is not a social approach to witches, but a philosophical analysis and ethical critique of the idea of witch and the practices it generates and justifies. Since everyone now knows that there are no witches, no explanation of their non-existence is necessary. However, since everyone now knows that there are mental diseases, no explanation of their non-existence can be convincing. The reason why professionals who speak like this, and lay people who hear them speak, know that I must be wrong lies, in this case, not so much in inattention to what constitutes a disease, as in an unshakable presumption that the term mental illness, or schizophrenia, is the name of a real disease. Rejecting bodily lesion as a criterion of illness. Among my more thoughtful critics must be counted Sir Martin Roth, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Cambridge and a leading contemporary British psychiatrist. Roth's argument flows from his premise that my definition of disease is unacceptable. Of course, he concedes, if illness is a matter of lumps, lesions, and germs, most schizophrenics are perfectly healthy, but such a definition of disease would be repudiated even by physicians. As I have shown, however, this is not so. Pathologists define disease exactly as I do, or rather vice versa, and non-psychiatric physicians often adhere to the pathologist's criteria, except insofar as mental diseases are concerned. What, then, is Roth's criterion of literal illness? He does not have one. Instead, he claims all of life for psychiatry with the seemingly humane and disarming assertion that psychiatry is primarily concerned with mental suffering, its mitigation and prevention irrespective of cause. Roth's strict orthodoxy may account for his being so irritated by my irreverent heterodoxy. Szasz's meteoric rise, his growing influence and world renown are not, therefore, unexpected. He writes begrudgingly. The reasons are perhaps to be found in the verdict. I think that bad philosophers may have a certain influence, good philosophers never. Surely, such a quip falls far short of British standards of intellectual debating. Paradoxically, Roth's most serious criticism comes closest to what I consider to be one of my most important claims. The attitude of the law and the legal profession to psychiatry and mental disorder has been transformed by the writings of Thomas Szasz. He is obsessed by the need he feels for psychiatric patients, psychotic or neurotic, to be accepted by all of us as human beings of no less value than ourselves, and therefore not ill. Roth seems to object to my proposal that we accept persons denominated as mental patients as human beings of no less value than ourselves. However, instead of telling us why we should not do so, he merely adds, and therefore not ill. One assumes Roth does this to make my views seem absurd, but I think his tactic backfires. We accept patients with polio and Parkinsonism as fully human, albeit ill. Why, then, should we not also accept patients with psychosis as fully human, albeit ill? Why should illness negate moral agency? Roth never engages the argument. Charles Krauthammer, a psychiatrist turned social commentator, rejects bodily lesion as a criterion of illness. First, however, he summarizes the practical consequences of my work. As a polemicist, Szasz has no peer. He has succeeded in focusing attention on the loose and easy quality of psychiatric definitions, on the destructive and indelible stigma that often accompanies psychiatric diagnosis, and on the unique and easily corrupted power that psychiatry has been granted. He has spawned an entire movement of anti-psychiatry, complete with schools, sages, and schisms. Ripples from his abolitionist crusade against commitment laws are only now being felt. Self-help groups and legal defense funds for mental patients have sprung up throughout the country. Szasz deserves much of the credit. Nevertheless, Krauthammer considers my argument fundamentally flawed. Few people are aware, he writes, that the entire argument depends on an unusual definition of illness. The only real illness, Szasz says, is a bodily lesion. As I have shown, Chapter 1, there is nothing unusual about this definition. Krauthammer notes, and I agree, that bodily abnormality simply is not the same as illness. In addition, a judgment made by individuals, patients, experts, physicians, professional organizations, medical societies, and political entities, governments, is required to transform a deviation from a biological or other norm into a disease. Many epileptics, Krauthammer observes, have no detectable brain lesions or brainwave abnormality. On the other hand, many perfectly normal people, when screened, turn out to have abnormal brainwaves. According to Szasz's criterion, the former are well, the latter diseased. That is not correct. These examples do not defeat my argument, as Krauthammer claims. I do not contend that persons exhibiting genuine epileptic seizures or suffering from migraine, another of Krauthammer's examples, are well. I view such persons as having bodily diseases without presently demonstrable pathoanatomical or pathophysiological correlates or lesions. In other words, they suffer from what I call putative diseases. Nor do I claim that persons with abnormal brainwaves, but without any other signs or symptoms of epilepsy, are necessarily ill or have a disease. I claim only that such persons exhibit deviations from certain biological norms, in this case the norms defined by electroencephalography. The relationship between proven violations of biological norms, bodily lesions, and diseases is similar to the relationship between proven violations of legal norms, lawbreaking, and crime. Terms such as illness or disease and crime imply not only that certain phenomena or events have been observed or exist, but also that it is socially legitimate to classify them in a particular way or to give them certain names. It is an empirical question whether a deviation identified by means of mechanical, electrical, or chemical tests, for example, by sphygmomanometer, blood pressure measurements, or electroencephalography, measurement of brain waves, is relevant to human health. If it is relevant, as in the case of blood pressure, then the abnormal measurement itself may reasonably be said to be, or signify the presence of, a disease. If it is not relevant, as in the case of brain waves, then the abnormal measurement is not enough for such a conclusion. Some tests are better than others, just as some people are richer or smarter than others. The specter of conspiracy. A decidedly less thoughtful refutation of my views rests on the mistaken belief that a myth is something invented by one group of persons to confuse or persecute another. As a result, I am viewed as a conspiracy theorist who blames psychiatrists for inventing insanity. Many critics have adopted this view, including some mental health professionals who, having made mental patient advocacy their career, seem to believe that doing their job properly requires accepting the proposition that mental illness is a bona fide disease. For example, Larry Gostin, the legal director of Mind, a mental patient advocacy group in Britain, writes, "There is a deep intuitive recognition of the existence of insanity. There is a common sense acceptance that madness is not a myth invented by medicine. However, intuitive recognition and common sense acceptance do not count for much in trying to understand why Negro slaves should be counted as 3/5 rather than 5/5 human, or why certain criminals should be treated as mad rather than as bad." Getting personal. Another rather unimaginative counterargument goes like this. So you think mental illness is not real? Try telling that to a catatonic patient in a mental hospital or to his mother. Since I do not try to tell anything to anyone who does not ask my advice or opinion, and since catatonic patients and their relatives convinced of the reality of mental illness usually do not ask for my opinion, the injunction is moot. If a person thinks that one can lose one's mind, just as one can lose one's car keys, why should I try to tell him about the metaphoric uses of the word lose and the tragedies it can mask when used as an adjective to qualify a man's mind? In a more personal vein, some psychiatrists criticize me for being too liberal, libertarian, while others accuse me of being too authoritarian. For example, Donald Klein, a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, writes, "Authoritarians, on the other hand, claiming that mental illness is a myth, condemn assaultive paranoids to jail and suicidal depressives to death. I believe that their real covert agenda is the promulgation of a heartless individualism whose target is not the malingerer or the criminal disguised as mentally ill, but the poor, disadvantaged, and socially deprived. Although Klein never mentions my name and does not list any of my publications in his references, I take this to be his reply to my views. Klein does not bother to explain why individuals who assault others should not be punished, nor why punishing them by means of psychiatric sanctions is necessarily or self-evidently superior, as a social policy, to punishing them by means of criminal sanctions. The proposition that not coercing an individual whom psychiatrists call suicidal is synonymous with condemning him to death is now so intrinsic a part of the language of psychiatry that psychiatrists do not even notice what they are saying, or if they do notice it, are proud of it. Clearly, when a person embracing psychiatric coercion calls another who eschews such coercion authoritarian, then we are in the presence of a profound transvaluation of our values and transformation of our language. Does Klein offer a defense of psychiatric coercion? Not really, since he views it as self-evidently necessary and useful. Does anyone believe, he asks, that if commitment were outlawed, the FBI would be better controlled? It would be uncharitable, and perhaps risky as well, to comment on Klein's choice of words, since another critic states that I overestimate the importance of words. Szasz may be revealing the presence and influence of a belief that words can actually create and destroy. He then cites several of my aphorisms ostensibly supporting this interpretation and continues, to believe that words can be used to create or destroy is to believe in word magic, something which, as psychoanalysts have learned, is typical at the age of 2 or so, but which becomes increasingly unusual thereafter. Other critics say more explicitly that my views are the symptoms of mental illness. Dr. Thomas Szasz, declares a psychiatrist, is widely recognized in authoritative medical circles for his paranoiac utterances of psychiatry. Miscellaneous refutations. Nathaniel Lauer, a professor of psychiatry at Yale, is a careful and conscientious commentator on my writings, but he sometimes misconstrues my views and then criticizes the misconstruction. For example, he writes, Thomas Szasz is an uncompromising thinker and a brave psychiatrist. For him, suffering and sorrow cannot serve as signs and symptoms for medical disease. Entity-only organic markers could serve this function. This is correct and complimentary, but then Lauer significantly misstates my views. Take away the suffering and no disease entity remains. Thus, says Szasz, mental illness is a mere myth, or at best, a mere metaphor. Hence, it is by claiming the mentally ill to be always autonomous, that is always free of specific, pathological organic constraints, and free to determine their own goals, that Szasz excludes the mentally ill from the realm of medicine and renders them always responsible. But I do not claim that persons denominated as mentally ill are always free of specific, pathological organic constraints. I clearly allow for the possibility that, like anyone else, such persons may suffer from undetected diseases. Moreover, it is not because I believe that so-called mentally ill persons are always autonomous that I want to treat them as responsible moral agents. I clearly state that since somatic pathology per se is not a sufficient condition for depriving a bodily ill person of moral agency, it should not be a sufficient condition in the case of a mentally ill person either. Lauer's misunderstanding of the concept of autonomy leads him, as it does many people, to being unable to distinguish between caring and coercing. Out of respect for the individual's alleged autonomy, he writes, Szasz requires we stand by while people drop dead on the streets. It is not clear why Lauer thinks I am opposed to someone offering money, food, or lodging to poor people, or anything else the generous donor thinks the recipient needs or wants. Indeed, although I am not enthusiastic about it, I willingly support a social policy whereby an agency of the state would offer food, shelter, and other services to people in need, provided that those delivering the services would be effectively prevented from coercing those who receive them. Credit for the most absurd counter-argument goes to Samuel Goose, who, in his zeal, bases his reasoning on his ignorance. The word disease, he asserts, has no literal meaning or use at all. Disease is a metaphoric concept. It may be said that there is no such thing as a disease. The concept of disease may be a myth. Imitation may be the highest form of flattery, but this is going too far. Perhaps because he is a psychiatrist, Gouze seems to believe that the word disease has only rhetorical uses and can have no descriptive meaning at all. In contrast to the foregoing refutations, most of which miss their mark by a mile or more, I now want to mention an argument that is cogent, albeit deceptive. No sooner did I suggest, almost 30 years ago, that mental illness is not a real disease, than psychiatrists started to say that I am partially right because, for example, hysteria is indeed not a real disease, but schizophrenia, of course, is. Since then, with increasing frequency, psychiatrists have discovered or decided that this or that formerly recognized mental illness, for example, homosexuality, is not a mental illness. In DSM-3, not only has the term neurosis been dropped, but so also has the term mental illness. It was replaced by mental disorder. Such claims attract much media attention and support, I believe because they simultaneously assert and deny the validity of the concept of mental illness. By asserting that X is not a mental illness, the speaker ostensibly informs us about the nature of X, while implying that although X is not a mental disease, Y and Z are. Again, the criterion for what constitutes illness or mental illness remains unexamined and unchallenged. This argument is tactically sound. By sacrificing some outlying positions, the defenders of a besieged army can retreat to the safety of their fortress. In this way, the defenders of the proposition that mental illness, exemplified by schizophrenia, is a brain disease get away unharmed without having to prove their case. Finally, my suggestion that mental illnesses are not bona fide diseases, that they are personal problems in living, was immediately and instinctively viewed, especially by psychiatrists, as an attempt to redistribute the wealth inherent in insanity. This is a false, though not entirely unjustifiable, interpretation. Speaking of so-called mental illnesses as problems in living does not imply that these problems are ipso facto the property of psychologists. Indeed, I have made it clear from the beginning of my work that the issue of control or ownership of conduct, healthy or sick, sane or insane, is an integral part of the problem of so-called mental illness. That in order to come to grips with these problems, we must decide whether we value freedom more than health or vice versa, and that I, placing freedom above health, advocate returning health and illness, mental health and mental illness, to their rightful owners, the so-called patients and mental patients, the persons who possess or are said to suffer from these conditions. Because the various criticisms I have just reviewed overlap and pivot around two important issues, I now want to rephrase them and my responses to them. Some critics say that I am wrong because what we now call mental diseases may yet be shown to be caused, at least in some cases, by subtle pathophysiological processes in the body, in particular by disorders in the molecular chemistry of the brain that we do not yet know how to measure or record. Nevertheless, such processes, like those responsible for the psychoses associated with paresis or pellagra, exist, and it is only because of the present state of our knowledge, or rather ignorance, that we cannot properly diagnose them. Actually, such an advance in the science and technology of medical diagnosis would only add to the list of literal diseases and would not in the slightest impair the validity of my argument that when we call certain kinds of disapproved behaviors mental diseases, we are using the word disease metaphorically. This objection to my views, which actually represents just another instance of biological reductionism, misses the point one tried to make. To uphold it would be like upholding the view that because certain canvases thought to be forged Renoirs proved to be, on closer study, genuine, all forged masterpieces are genuine. If there are real or literal diseases, there must also be others that are fake or metaphorical. Other critics say that I am wrong, not because I say that mental illnesses are unlike bodily illnesses, an assertion with which they claim to agree, nor because I say that involuntary hospitalization or treatment is no more justified for so-called mental illness than it is for bodily illness, a moral principle with which they also claim to be in sympathy. but because the term mental illness often designates a phenomenologically identifiable and hence valid category of conduct. But I do not deny that. I have never maintained that the conduct of a depressed or elated person is the same as that of a person who is contented and even-tempered, or that the conduct of a person who claims to be Jesus or Napoleon is the same as that of one who makes no such false claims. I simply prefer not to place deviance in the category of disease. Psychiatric intervention, literal or metaphorical treatment. Although common sense, which sometimes affirms timeless truths and sometimes egregious errors, is not a reliable guide to reality, we must always pay heed to it. As common sense tells us that where there is smoke, there is fire, so it also tells us that where there is treatment, allegedly or ostensibly or seemingly effective treatment, there is disease. As I noted earlier, psychiatrists often rest their claim that mental illness is a neurochemical disease on the fact that they treat it as if it were such a disease. And lay people often believe that mental illness is a real disease because it is being treated by psychiatrists. Accordingly, I now want to say something about psychiatric treatment, an idea that stands in the same relation to psychiatric illness as a key stands to a lock. As the idea of a lock implies that of a key and vice versa, so the idea of mental illness implies that of mental treatment and vice versa. Hence, if there is no mental illness, there can be no such thing as mental treatment. What, then, is it that psychiatrists do when they dispense what they call psychiatric treatments or practice what they call psychotherapy? My answer is, they dispense pseudo-medical, metaphorical treatments. Let me briefly explain what I mean. Psychiatric interventions as metaphorical treatments. There are 3 reasons for holding that psychiatric treatments are metaphorical treatments. First, if the conditions psychiatrists seek to cure are not literal diseases, then the procedures they use to influence them cannot be literal treatments. For sick economies, the cures must be metaphorical, which is not to say that the level of employment is not real or does not affect the economy. Similarly, drugs and dialogues are real and may indeed help people said to be mentally ill. But this proves not that mental diseases are literal maladies, but only that mental treatments can be effective interventions. Second, we must again face the fact that psychiatric treatments are often imposed on persons against their will. If a surgeon operates on a competent adult without the patient's consent, the intervention, even if curative, constitutes assault and battery. We make this judgment because our conventional concept of treatment condenses 2 very important ideas, namely, that a medical treatment is an intervention believed to help a condition called a disease, and that it is desired and consented to by the person who has the disease. Logically, if there is no disease, there can be no treatment. No treatment can exist. Legally, if there is no consent, not necessarily the patient's, there can be no treatment. Treatment may not be given. Moreover, there are many diseases for which there are no treatments. To be sure, there is always something the doctor can do, and something the patient wants done, and that something is conventionally called treatment. Similarly, there are many consensual relations between psychiatrists and patients. Psychiatrists give and mental patients receive certain things, and those interventions are conventionally called mental or psychiatric treatments. Psychotherapies in general, and psychoanalysis in particular, exemplify this class of interventions. Just what are they? Are they properly called treatments? I believe the answer is no. Finally, then, we must consider the nature of so-called psychotherapeutic procedures, the paradigmatic interventions psychiatrists provide for voluntary patients. There are many kinds of psychotherapies. I shall use individual psychotherapy as my model. Since this procedure consists basically of a confidential conversation between 2 people, it can be therapeutic only in a metaphorical sense. In the 18th century, when people spoke of the cure of souls, everyone knew that the diseases such cures were supposed to heal were spiritual, that the therapists were clerical, and that the cures were metaphorical. Today, with the soul securely displaced by the mind, and the mind securely subsumed as a function of the brain, people speak of the cure of minds, and everyone knows that the diseases the psychiatrist treats are similar to ordinary medical diseases, that the therapists who administer such treatments are bona fide physicians and that the cures are the results of literal treatments. In short, mental illness and mental treatment are symmetrical and indeed symbiotic ideas. The extension of the idea of somatic therapy into psychotherapy and the metaphorization of personal influence as therapy coincide with the extension of pathology into psychopathology and the metaphorization of personal problems as mental diseases. In this connection, I want to say something more about the psychiatric treatment now most in fashion, namely the use of so-called neuroleptic, psychotropic, or antipsychotic drugs. Because of the social circumstances in which psychiatrist and mental patient typically encounter each other, it is impossible to know whether most people now receiving so-called psychopharmacological therapy really want to take psychiatric drugs. That psychiatrists want to give patients such drugs is clear. Indeed, the allegedly therapeutic powers of these drugs is now used as a fresh justification for psychiatric coercion, as the following statement, excerpted from a legal brief filed by the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, illustrates. The vast majority of patients committed to an institution, especially a state-run facility, need some form of drug therapy. Psychotic disease alters the minds of afflicted patients. Antipsychotic medication is mind restorative. It would be a clinical error to deny a schizophrenic patient an antipsychotic drug. Antipsychotic drugs are the single best available treatment for schizophrenia. The commitment of a patient to a state psychiatric facility includes an implicit prescription for active treatment rather than mere custodial care. Proper medical treatment of psychotic patients has come to necessarily include the use of antipsychotic drugs. Concerning the medical treatment of rational patients, the philosophy of a person being his own judge as to whether treatment is justified is a laudable goal. For severely ill psychiatric patients, however, this model of the individual rationally balancing the risks and benefits of antipsychotic medication fails. As my objections to coerced psychiatric treatments are a matter of long record by now, my views on the deplorable practice of forcibly drugging mental patients should be clear without further comment. At the same time, it must be remembered that many people willingly submit to psychiatric treatments of all sorts and eagerly take psychiatric drugs such as Valium, Haldol, or lithium. A supporter of conventional psychiatric wisdom might therefore ask, doesn't that prove that mental patients find relief in these treatments? And if they do, it may seem like a small step to conclude that people so treated and helped suffer from a genuine illness. But let us see just what inference we should more correctly draw from the fact that many people willingly take psychotropic drugs and are said to be helped by them. Most people, mental patients included, like to take drugs. If they must seek out and pay for the drug, as people must now seek out and pay for alcohol and cigarettes, marijuana and heroin, then ipso facto, that proves that they like to take that drug. Whether such drugs can, in a meaningful sense, be said to help those who take them cannot be answered without first answering the question, help them achieve what goal, satisfy what craving or need. Of course, we can use the word help in effect as a tautology, inferring help from the subject's own repeated acts of drug taking. Obviously, that is not a medical or scientific standard for determining therapeutic effectiveness. Furthermore, since there are no objective standards or measures for determining improvement or deterioration in mental disease, as there are, say, in diabetes or hypertension, the assertion that a particular drug helps a patient is nothing but an assertion or claim. There are many possibilities along this line. For example, a person may claim to feel better after taking Haldol or lithium because in fact he feels better. Or his wife may say he is better because she feels better. Or his psychiatrist may say he is better because he feels better. However, none of this proves that the alleged condition for which the patient was getting or taking Haldol, and which is now said to be improved because of Haldol, is a bona fide, literal illness. Our criterion for literal medical illness, as I emphasized at the beginning of this book, is pathoanatomical and pathophysiological. We do not infer the presence of medical illness from the fact that after taking a drug, a person, called a patient, claims to feel better, or from the fact that someone else claims he acts better. Hence, the alleged effectiveness of psychiatric drugs is no better evidence for the existence or reality of mental disease qua brain disease than was the alleged effectiveness of electroshock or lobotomy, whose inventor received the Nobel Prize. The problem of definition reconsidered. Writers on mental illness, law, and psychiatry are wont to engage in endless debates about what constitutes illness or mental illness. These exercises invariably focus on the question of whether we should define these classes broadly or narrowly. This approach is a kind of shadow boxing. It avoids the core issue, namely the distinction between the literal and metaphorical uses of words. As we saw, definitions of mental illness range from the view that mental illness is proven or putative brain disease, a narrow definition, to the view that it is the human condition itself, a broad definition. To my knowledge, no modern authority addressing this subject has been willing to look at the problem through the resolving lenses of literal, metaphorical meaning. But looking at mental diseases without those lenses is like looking at orthopedic diseases without X-rays. We miss more than we see. Literalizing the medical metaphor. One of my aims in the earlier chapters has been to offer literal definitions of having an illness and being a patient. If we accept these definitions, even if only for the sake of clarifying our understanding of the scope and function of medicine and psychiatry, then we can conclude that illness and mental illness, patient and mental patient, doctor and psychiatrist, medical hospital and mental hospital stand in the same relation to one another as a literal, biological, father stands to a metaphoric, theological father or priest. If there is no literal meaning of the word father, there can be no metaphorical meaning of it either. People might then be led to believe that further theological research could demonstrate that the fatherhood of priests is just as real as that of genuine, biological fathers. Psychiatry rests precisely on such a conflation and confusion of literal and metaphorical meanings. That is, on the metaphoric conversion of problems in living into illnesses and on the literalization of the metaphor of illness. In the Mass and through the priest, bread and wine are miraculously transformed into the body and blood of Jesus. Denying that transformation and insisting that the consecrated bread and wine are nothing but bread and wine used to be regarded as religious heresy. Mutatis mutandis, in modern society and through the psychiatrist, human difficulties are scientifically transformed into medical diseases. Sophisticated moderns may doubt the transubstantiation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, but they do not doubt the transubstantiation of deviance into disease. Indeed, denying this miraculous transformation and insisting that psychiatrically diagnosed personal and social problems are nothing but personal and social problems is now regarded as scientific heresy. This is the reason, I believe, why even scholars at ease with the idea of metaphor and aware of the analogical nature of mental illness still give it a medical meaning. For example, Herbert Fingaret states, "One thing is plain. The notion of mental disease is understood against the background notion of disease in the realm of physical disorders. There are deep analogies at work here, and no doubt other related pairs of terms reflect the same sort of analogy: sound mind and sound body, physical health and mental health, physical breakdown and mental breakdown." Fingaret goes on to argue that insanity and mental illness are not medical concepts and states. It is plain that at the heart of the issue of insanity lies the notion of rationality. I cite this example out of a great many similar statements in the literature to illustrate that established academics and intellectuals can now be counted on to support and validate the medical myths of the psychiatrist, just as not so long ago they could be counted on to support and validate the religious myths of the priest. James Turner's observation concerning the development of religious unbelief is pertinent in this connection. Unbelief in God, he writes, thus required so extreme an estrangement from obvious reality as to be, if not strictly impossible, practically so for medieval men and women. The same, I believe, is now true for unbelief in mental illness. Let us make no mistake about it. It is one thing to place different bodily diseases, for example arthritis and glaucoma, in the same class, and quite another to place bodily diseases and mental diseases in the same class. In the former case, we build a category on the basis of a clearly and carefully defined criterion for membership in it, namely, a pathoanatomical or pathophysiological lesion. This is why arthritis and glaucoma are both diseases, although they do not look alike. However, if we place bodily diseases and mental diseases in the same class, we build a category without a clear or carefully defined criterion for membership in it, on the basis that its members look alike. Diabetes and depression are both diseases because they both cause suffering. Eagles and bats are both birds because they both fly. The logical error of making such a category mistake, as the British philosopher Gilbert Ryle called it, is clear enough. However, the confusions so caused in the specific instance of mental illness are not, and are therefore worth briefly restating. 1. What is it? What is the event, phenomenon, quality, or thing we are talking about when we call it mental illness? The answer is, it might be a brain disease, as in neurosyphilis, or disapproved behavior, as in depression or depravity, crime, or the attribution of irrationality, irresponsibility, and insanity to an adversary, as in calling a public figure schizophrenic. 2. What should we call it? What name should we attach to the event, phenomenon, quality, or thing we are observing and describing? The answer is, we can call it psychopathology, insanity, or mental illness, madness or genius, conflict, deviance, or disagreement, psychiatric scapegoating and victimization, or simply human behavior. 3. How should we treat it? What personal attitude and social policy should we adopt toward the event, phenomenon, quality, or thing? The answer is, we can treat it as an illness, provided the person who has it approves, or as a mental illness, regardless of whether or not the person who has it approves, or as deviance or crime, and punish it, or as admirable behavior or artistic achievement, and reward it, or as behavior requiring us to adjust our actions to it, as any other behavior does, or as something uninteresting and of no concern to us. The mythology of mental illness and the rituals of psychiatry now make it virtually impossible for professional and layman alike to distinguish between phenomenon, label, and policy. This explains, for example, the persistent but erroneous belief that if persons now diagnosed as schizophrenic were shown to be suffering from diseases of the brain, that would justify and make possible their involuntary treatment. However, persons suffering from diseases of the central nervous system are not, and legally cannot be, treated against their will. Thus, even if persons diagnosed as schizophrenic were suffering from a demonstrable brain disease, treating them involuntarily would still require that they be declared insane as well. Truly, mental illness is like a genie we have summoned to help us solve our problems. Now, he is the problem. Much time will pass, and much suffering will be inflicted and endured before we shall succeed in getting him back into his bottle.